The cafe reeked of burnt espresso and quiet, lingering regrets, a scent so familiar that I no longer even recognized it. The flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow haze over everything, turning even the happiest customers into dim shadows of themselves. My feet throbbed inside the old thrift store sneakers I had worn for nearly 9 months, shoes I could no longer afford to replace, not when the rent was already 2 weeks overdue, and the daycare bill for little Lily swallowed most of my paycheck before I ever really touched it. I drifted between the tables like a ghost, pouring coffee, forcing a smile that never reached my eyes. No one spoke to me. Not the cook, not the barista, not even Melinda, who spent all day shouting out order names without lifting her face from her phone. I simply existed, present, yet fading, alive, but not truly living. And then they walked in, 3 men in impeccably tailored suits, sharp and spotless in a way that did not belong in this rundown cafe on the south side of Chicago. And the fourth, the one with storm-gray eyes and a presence that seemed to freeze the air around him. I had no idea then, but that moment, just that single moment, changed everything. I remember clearly it was a Tuesday, a quiet noon like any other. The sky was dull, the wind cold enough to slip through the gaps in the cafe's old door, making the little bell above it ring softly each time someone entered. But no one had come in for a while. The place was so empty I could hear the espresso machine hissing and the wind howling outside. I was wiping down table number 8 when the bell chimed again. I didn't turn around right away, probably just another regular grabbing a to-go order. But then I heard the heavy tap of leather shoes on the worn wooden floor, a chair scraping back, a low, commanding voice, not a regular. I turned, and my heart seemed to stop for a beat. 4 men, 3 sitting rigidly in the corner booth, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, carrying themselves in a way no ordinary man ever did. And the 4th, sitting apart, back against the wall, eyes scanning every movement in the room as if mapping exits. He wore a long black coat over a fitted suit that shaped itself to his tall, solid frame. His hair was a deep, dark shade, slightly curled at the ends, with faint strands of silver near his temples. But it was his eyes that held me. Eyes the color of ash in winter storms, cold and unreadable, as if they had seen horrors I never wanted to imagine. They didn't order right away. They simply sat there, speaking to one another in a language I had not heard in a very long time, Russian. Their voices were low, fast, threaded with something that raised goosebumps on my skin. I didn't know why they chose this cafe. It was old, battered, with chipped tables and watered-down coffee, a place where no one in designer suits ever walked in. But they came, and I was there, not knowing that minutes later, a single careless sentence from my mouth would alter the course of my entire life, not knowing that the man with the gray eyes would find something he never expected in a shabby Chicago cafe, not knowing that from that day forward, I would never again be Claire Bennett, the invisible waitress with worn-out shoes and a tired, fading heart. If you are watching this story and wish to follow every step as fate begins to shift beneath my feet, please remember to subscribe to our channel, to like and to share so this story can reach more people each day, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from, which city, which quiet corner of the world is witnessing this moment when everything starts to change. Because every small dot you leave behind lets me know just how far my story has traveled into the hearts of those who are walking this path with me. I held the warm coffee pot in my hand and walked slowly toward table 11, where the 4 men had just taken their seats. My eyes flicked briefly toward Melinda, who was pretending to be busy behind the counter but was clearly watching. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath. I could hear every beat of my own heart as I approached the table. One of the 3 men in a gray suit spoke first, his voice gentle yet edged with tension as he glanced at the man seated across from him. The second man intertwined his fingers on the table, the sleeve of his jacket slipping back just enough to reveal a Cyrillic tattoo on his wrist, unmistakably Russian. The third, younger, handsome, in a sharp, cold way like carved stone, was idly rolling the silver spoon between his fingers, as if waiting for something to happen. And at the center sat the man with the gray eyes, looking straight at me, unblinking, unsmiling. Those eyes made me feel as if he were scanning through me with an X-ray beam, seeing through every layer of disguise, every scar inside me, every fragment of broken memory I thought I had buried. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What would you like to order?" My voice came out softer than usual, barely more than a breath. No one answered at once. The storm-eyed man tilted his head slightly, never looking away from me, and then spoke in English tinged with an Eastern European accent. "Black coffee, 4 cups, No sugar, no cream. I nodded. Very well, I will bring it right out. But I could not turn away immediately, because those eyes were still fixed on me as if he were trying to remember where he had seen me before, or discovering something that had not yet been spoken aloud. A faint shiver ran down my spine. I returned to the counter and began pouring 4 cups of coffee into white ceramic mugs. My hands trembled slightly despite my effort to control them. Melinda glanced at me through the small mirror hanging behind the espresso machine. "Be careful," she whispered without lifting her eyes from her phone. "They do not look like people who came here just for coffee." I did not respond. I knew. I had sensed it from the very first second they walked in. When I returned to the table, I forced my steps to stay even, setting each cup down carefully. The 3 other men glanced at me only once before resuming their hushed conversation in Russian. Only the man with the gray eyes, Nick, still had his gaze locked on me. It was not the intrusive stare of the obnoxious customers I had dealt with, nor any ordinary curiosity. It was the kind of look that made you feel as though you were standing before a tribunal, where he was both the judge and the keeper of the final, irrevocable sentence. When I placed the last cup in front of him, he finally spoke. Slowly. "Thank you." His voice was low and soft, but sharp as a blade. I nodded, not daring to say more, and was just about to turn away when he spoke again, this time in Russian. A simple sentence, but enough to make my heart skip. "Я люблю этот запах, I like this scent." I do not know what compelled me to answer, perhaps reflex, perhaps instinct, but I replied, in Russian, fluently, without a second thought. "Это напоминает мне о детстве." It reminds me of my childhood. The instant the words left my mouth, I knew I had made a mistake. The air around the table shifted at once, still, heavy. The 3 other men stopped speaking, turning their heads toward me in unison. The man on the left shifted slightly, his hand sliding beneath the table. The man in the middle clenched his jaw, his eyes sharpening with caution. The youngest tilted his head, assessing the threat. And Nick did not move. He simply looked at me as if confirming something important. The look was no longer an evaluation, it was recognition, as though he had just found a missing piece he had been searching for. I opened my mouth to apologize, but my throat tightened. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but interest and danger. And in that moment, I understood that he had learned something about me, something I myself had not yet fully remembered. I should not have spoken, but it was already too late. I turned and walked away, trying not to reveal the trembling in each step. The air around their table was still stretched tight, like a violin string about to snap. I reached the counter, grabbed a cleaning cloth, and pretended to busy myself, though my eyes kept following the corner table through the scratched metal reflection behind the espresso machine. Nick was holding a phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving me. He was silent for a few seconds before he began speaking in Russian. Not loudly, not quickly, but with every word clear and deliberate. I did not want to hear, but each sentence, each syllable drifted toward me like a spell, pulling me back into a part of my mind I thought had been locked away forever. "Я нашел ее. Я уверен, это она." I found her. I am certain it is her. My heart jolted as if squeezed by an invisible hand. My fingers clenched the cloth so tightly the knuckles turned white. Just one sentence, yet it carried the weight of something immense. I knew I should not listen. I should not stand there. But I could not move. His voice continued, deeper now, shorter. "Da, глаза, accent, она помнит." Yes, the eyes, the accent. She remembers. I did not understand everything, but I heard the final 2 words clearly. She remembers. The words slipped into my mind like a key turning an old lock, and suddenly memories shattered open like shards of glass scattering in the light. Winter nights sharp as blades on the skin, a soft lullaby in Russian, a gray-haired woman holding me against her chest. The images were blurred, tangled, but the feeling was unmistakable, vivid as if it had happened only yesterday. I startled when I realized I had spoken aloud, this time without any conscious intention. "Moja mama tak говорила." My mother used to say that. The sentence escaped before I could stop it, and this time it was not only the 4 men at table 11 who froze. Melinda, holding an order slip, snapped her head up. She did not understand Russian, but the abrupt silence was enough to draw her attention. Nick stopped mid-sentence. He did not lower the phone the way he had earlier. He ended the call instantly, his gaze slicing through the space between us like a blade made of air. The other 3 stared at me as if I had just torn open a disguise they had spent years constructing. The tattooed man tilted his head. his lips forming a word too quiet for me to catch. The younger one pressed his mouth into a line, his eyes shifting quickly as though calculating something. And Nick stood up, without warning. He walked toward me, slow, deliberate, step by step, not needing speed because he already knew I would not run. I felt rooted to the floor. My hand still held the cloth, now damp with sweat. He stopped 3 steps away from me. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to thicken the air between us. "How long have you known Russian?" His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an order. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry, tight. A part of me wanted to flee. Another part could not pull away from his gaze. I do not know. I learned when I was a child. A little. I am not sure." The words came out broken, stumbling. Nick narrowed his eyes. "Who taught you?" I looked at him, then answered more quietly. "A woman. My foster mother. When I was little. In the north, not long." He was silent for several seconds. Then he turned abruptly toward the table, reached into his coat, pulled out a business card, and placed it on the counter beside the espresso machine. "If you remember anything else, call." I did not respond. I could not meet his eyes. He turned and walked away, the other 3 following him, leaving the cafe without taking a single sip of the coffee I had served. The wind chime above the door rang one last time before the door swung shut behind them. I remained standing there, not understanding what had just happened. But I knew, somehow, that I had brushed against a thread connecting me to a world I never imagined I would have to face. And the man with the ash-gray eyes would come back. I remained frozen after the cafe door closed, the faint echo of the small bell still trembling somewhere inside my chest, like a clock striking the hour for something that had only just begun. My hand was still clenched around the damp cloth, my heart beating so fast it felt as though my ribs might burst. The 4 men had walked out as if they had never been there at all, yet the air they left behind still pressed thickly against me. I stared at the business card on the counter, a strange mix of curiosity and fear rising inside me. The card was matte black, with only one line of raised silver lettering: Nikolai Volkov. No phone number, no address, just a name and a weight I could not name. I reached out to pick it up, but my trembling hand knocked over a glass nearby. The sharp crash rang out as it hit the floor and shattered into pieces. I flinched, my heart tripping all over again. The customers turned to look. Melinda shot me a glance cold as carved ice. "Claire, what was that?" I dropped to the floor instinctively, gathering shards of glass while my mind spun. I had slipped with my words, slipped with my eyes, slipped with the silence I should have kept. My hand grazed a larger shard, slicing a long line across my thumb. Blood welled up, but I felt no pain, only a vague fear swelling inside me. And then I felt a gaze. When I looked up, I saw Nick still standing there, just inside the glass door. He had not left. The other 3 were already outside, but he stood, turned back toward the cafe, looking through the glass straight at me. His eyes were no longer cold, but something else, something like he was observing a reaction, waiting for something from me. I stopped breathing, unsure whether it was fear or some unfamiliar feeling threading itself through my chest. He lifted a hand, signaling, a small, firm gesture, as if to say, "Leave it. Do not pick it up." I rose slowly, unable to tear my gaze away from him. Nick turned away a moment later, following the 3 dark figures into the street. I watched until his silhouette disappeared into the crowd. When I returned to the counter, the business card was still there, but now a stack of cash sat beside it. A $50 bill folded neatly, clipped with 100, and beneath them a 20, $170 in total. For 4 cups of coffee they had not taken a single sip of. I reached for it, but Melinda beat me to the counter. She stared at the money, then at me. Who were they? I shook my head, my voice cracked. "I do not know." She curled her lip, unconvinced, and walked away without another word. I gathered the money, tucked it with the business card, and placed both into my private drawer. My hand was still bleeding. The cut was small but sharp. I washed it under cold water, replaying Nick's voice on the phone, the way the men reacted, and the rush of everything that had happened. It had all unfolded too quickly, too strangely. But there was one thing I knew with certainty. This had not been a random encounter. And I was not just an invisible waitress in their eyes. They knew me. Or at least, they knew some part of me I had not yet understood myself. That night, after closing my shift and returning to my small apartment, I placed the business card on the table as if it were some foreign object that needed to be kept at a distance. Yet my eyes never left the name printed on it. Nikolai Volkov. I repeated it in my mind, again and again, as if the sound of it might unlock answers to questions I had not even formed. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those ash-gray eyes fixed on me, and the unspoken question circling through my thoughts. Who are they? And why am I the one they are watching? I returned to the small apartment on the third floor of an old building at the end of the street, the kind of place where the hallway always smelled damp, and the stairwell lights flickered as though they, too, were exhausted just like me. Lily had gone to sleep early. She was always good on the nights when I worked the late shift. I stepped quietly into her room, kissed her forehead, then collapsed onto the worn sofa. In my hand was the black business card that had not left my wallet since the moment I walked out of the cafe. His name rose under the warm yellow glow of the desk lamp. Nikolai Volkov. I read it for the 50th time that day. No phone number, nothing else but the name. Yet that name alone stirred a chaos inside me I could not explain, as if it dragged along a strange current of memories waking from somewhere deep beneath the surface. Fragmented dreams, muffled sounds from childhood, the soft Russian voice of a woman whose face I could no longer recall. I did not call. Even though my mind replayed a dozen imagined conversations, what I would ask him, how I would confront him, why he had looked at me that way, how he knew I spoke Russian, why he left me a business card and a pile of anonymous money. But then I remembered those gray eyes, and the way the three men reacted to a single, unconscious sentence that slipped from my mouth. And I knew my instincts were right. If I had any sense left, I should not call. That night I tossed and turned. The old clock on the wall ticked heavily, pressing each second deeper into my chest. I could not sleep. Every time I drifted off, I saw the scene in the cafe again, his gaze, his voice. Near dawn, I finally fell into a brief, thin sleep. When I woke, sunlight had already slipped through the thin curtains and into Lily's small bedroom. I washed my face, tied my hair, changed into my uniform, and took her to daycare. On the way, something felt wrong. A feeling faint but persistent. I turned back twice while passing the grocery store, certain someone was watching me. A man wearing a cap and sunglasses stood near a food cart. When I looked toward him, he turned away. Another man sat on a bench not far away, eyes glued to his phone, yet he never moved the entire time I waited at the crosswalk. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the leftover shock from last night. But when I returned to the apartment after dropping Lily off, I knew I had not imagined it. My door was unlocked. I remembered locking it. I stood frozen before the slightly open door, my heart pounding so hard my chest ached. My mind flooded with every worst-case scenario. I drew a breath, pulled out my keys, gripping them like a temporary weapon, and pushed the door open. Silence. I stepped inside, one careful step at a time. Nothing looked disturbed, yet something was unmistakably wrong. The air, the scent. It no longer smelled like the tiny apartment with cheap laundry detergent. It smelled different, cold, sharp, like the leather of a new expensive coat. I walked to the dining table and saw it. A handwritten note placed neatly in the center. Only a few words in English. "We need to talk. 2 in the afternoon. Do not tell anyone." Beneath the note was a small photograph. In the picture was me, standing in front of the cafe, captured with such clarity that every strand of hair was visible. The shot had been taken from a high angle, likely from the building across the street. Underneath it, the date yesterday. My knees gave out and I fell into the chair, my hands shaking, my heart pounding like a drum. I did not need another explanation. They had been watching me. They knew where I lived, where I went, where my daughter went to school. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard a knock on the door. Not hurried, not forceful. 3 knocks, steady and certain. I opened the door. 2 men stood there, no suits, no dark glasses. One was tall, with a beard and eyes sharp enough to cut. The other was shorter, blonde hair cropped tight, his hands buried casually in his coat pockets. The tall one spoke first, his voice low and cold. "You are Claire Bennett." I nodded, barely recognizing my own voice when I asked, "Who are you?" He pulled out a small metal badge, not police, no emblem, only Cyrillic lettering. "Alexei." The other nodded slightly. "Dmitri." They did not need to say anything else. I knew they came from the world of Nick Volkov, and I knew I had no choice but to listen, because clearly, my ordinary life had ended the moment I carelessly spoke one sentence in Russian. I do not remember clearly how I got into the car, only that when I settled into the back seat, The door closed with a heavy sound, like a final period marking the end of the life I had been trying so desperately to hold on to. Alexei sat in the front, never turning around, occasionally glancing at me through the rearview mirror with an expression that mixed caution with something that felt almost like pity. Dmitri sat beside me, his hand resting on his knee, silent, as though his silence itself was his sharpest weapon. The car slid past the familiar streets of the south side, then turned onto a quiet boulevard lined with bare trees. At the end of the road stood a large old house with dark gray shingles and a wrought iron gate nearly 3 meters high. Dmitri stepped out first and opened the door for me. I climbed out, my legs still trembling. The gate opened automatically as we approached, and the car continued across a wide stone courtyard, stopping in front of a heavy wooden door with a brass handle carved in the shape of a phoenix. My mind swirled with questions, but all of them fell away when the door opened, and I saw Nick standing there. No long coat, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a cup of tea in his hand. He looked at me as though he had always known I would come. "Come in, Claire." His voice was the same, low, steady, stripped of emotion. I stepped inside, unsure whether my legs still belonged to me. The room I entered did not resemble anything I had imagined for a Mafia hideout. There were no guns on the walls, no skull icons, no armed guards lined up on either side. Instead, there was a warm living room filled with books, deep wine-colored velvet sofas, and a fireplace burning softly with the faint scent of pine wood. Nick gestured for me to sit, then took the seat across from me, setting his cup down. I could see his eyes more clearly now, no longer the cold silver they had been the day before, but heavy with years of exhaustion. "Claire, I know you have many questions, and so do I, but today, I will speak first." He opened a drawer, pulled out a thick, worn yellow envelope, placed it in front of me, and nudged it gently my way. I did not open it. I just looked at him. "This is your original file. Your name is not Claire Bennett, at least not in the beginning." I could not breathe. It felt as though something had yanked me out of reality and left everything around me blurred and distant. He continued, his voice unchanged. "You were born in the outskirts of St. Petersburg. Your mother was Katya Volkov. Your father was Michael Bennett, an American. They met during a medical research exchange program. You were born not long after, but things were not simple. Michael was suspected of espionage. Katya was hunted for opposing a local Mafia faction. They fled to America, changed their names, cut ties with everyone. A year later, they disappeared in a fire. I shook my head, feeling as though he were telling me the plot of a film and not the story of my own life. "I do not know them. I do not remember anything. I was 3 years old." Nick nodded. "That is why you do not remember. But the one who does is your grandmother, Irina Volkov." I had never heard the name before. Nick held my gaze for a long time. "She is Katya's mother, and she is the one who ordered the search for you for the past 10 years. My hands tightened, my chest crushed beneath 1,000 invisible stones. "Then what about you? Who are you?" Nick leaned back, his expression shifting into something unreadable. "I am the son of the man your mother once fought against, but I am also the one Irina trusts most to bring you home. The circle closes, Claire. You are not just a waitress, you are the last blood of the Volkov line." I sat there, my mind spinning, unsure of what to believe or deny, but deep inside my chest, my heart had already begun beating differently. There was a truth in his words that I could not push away, and what terrified me most was not what he said. It was the quiet realization that some part of me had always known. I did not know how long I had been sitting in that jasmine-scented room, only that the world seemed to stop turning the moment Nick spoke the name Irina Volkov, a name that meant nothing to me yet dropped into my life with the weight of lead, smudging everything I once believed was clear and certain. I had not even begun to ask a single question before he continued, his voice slower now, gentler in a way, as if he were turning the pages of an old book with reverence for every fragile crease. "Irina is the strongest woman I have ever known. She was the figurehead of the Volkov family, the one who ruled everything when my father was still alive and long after he was dead. She does not believe in tears, never allows weakness, and always keeps herself at the highest point of power, where no one dares challenge her. But when Katya vanished, she turned to stone. She did not speak for months, only sat before a small altar each day, staring at an old photograph of her daughter. Then one morning she stood up and declared she would find her granddaughter, whatever the cost." Nick poured more tea into my cup, but I did not lift my hand. My hands lay cold on my lap, my heart squeezed tight in my chest. I had never imagined I had family anywhere. I grew up in foster care, moved from house to house, and ended up with a temporary foster family in Minnesota. They were kind, but never truly mine. Every document stated my parents had died in an accident. I had never questioned it. I had no reason to question it. Until now. Nick slipped a small photograph from his inner pocket, the edges worn, the surface faded with age. He placed it on the table and nudged it toward me. In the picture was an elderly woman with silver hair pinned neatly back, a face lined with years yet an expression as sharp as forged steel. I stared and saw no familiarity, yet something inside me stirred with a quiet, unnameable tremor. Something deep and buried shifted. Nick spoke softly. She is dying. A weak heart, metastatic tumors, age finally claiming its due. She refused the best doctors available and asked for only one thing: to see the last piece of her bloodline before she leaves this world. That piece is you. His voice did not waver, but there was a thin layer of emotion beneath it, like a fragile sheet of ice stretched across a winter lake, hard to detect, yet undeniably present. Claire, she does not have much time. I know you are afraid. I know everything is happening too fast. But if you do not go, she will die without ever knowing her granddaughter survived. I blinked, feeling my lips turn dry. But why me? If I was just a child abandoned in the chaos, why would she care so much? Nick lifted his gaze, and for the first time his gray eyes carried something resembling sorrow. Because you are the only piece of Katya left in this world. Because you are their last chance to make right what generations before them broke. I lowered my head, my chest twisting like fabric wrung too tightly. I did not know this woman. I did not know anyone in the story he had just laid before me. But deep inside, something quiet began to rise. Not fear, not confusion. Something like a distant voice calling from the other side of my memories. A part of me, the part buried before I even learned to speak, wanted to know the truth. Wanted to look into the eyes of that woman. Wanted to understand why I grew up with no one. And more than anything, wanted to know whether someone had once loved me in this life. I lifted my eyes and met Nick's again. He did not push, did not pressure. He simply waited. I nodded, barely, almost unbelieving of the decision I had just made. But the words left my lips anyway. Take me to her. That morning, the Chicago sky hung gray and heavy like an old blanket draped over a city shifting seasons. I pulled on the thickest coat I owned and carried Lily in my arms as we stepped out of the building, my heart weighed down by thoughts I could not name. She nestled her head against my shoulder, still sleepy, clutching her worn little stuffed rabbit. I did not tell her where we were going, only that she would not be going to daycare today, and she simply nodded, trusting me the way any 3-year-old trusts her mother without question. The familiar black car was already waiting. Alexei was behind the wheel again, but Dmitri was absent. Instead, Nick sat in the back, turning his head slightly as I opened the door and buckled Lily into her car seat. He did not speak, only offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. The road to the Volkov estate was quiet, unlike the usual morning clamor. I watched the bare trees pass by the window, each one slipping past like memories returning from a place I had never known belonged to me. By the time we arrived, Lily had fallen asleep again. Nick gently lifted her from the seat, and I followed him through the slowly opening iron gates, across a mist-covered garden, and into the house where I would face my bloodline for the first time. Irina lay in a large room on the second floor, sunlight from the wide windows soft against her pale skin and the white strands of hair spread across her pillow. She was smaller than I expected, yet her presence filled the room with a force that made me hesitate at the threshold. She lay still, eyes closed, her expression peaceful as if dreaming of something long ago. A nurse whispered softly in Russian, and Irina opened her eyes. When her gaze met mine, time froze. Her eyes widened not in surprise, but in something deeper, sharper, overwhelming. I stepped closer, my heartbeat thundering in my chest as I tried to keep Lily calm in my arms while she began to stir awake. Irina lifted a trembling hand, her lips shaping a single word that stopped me cold. Katya. She did not look at me as if I were a stranger. She looked at me the way a mother looks at a daughter she believed long dead. Katya. She said it again, this time with tears sliding down her cheeks. Her hand reached toward my face, as though she needed to touch me to be sure I was real. I stood motionless, feeling as though I were living inside someone else's body, caught in a role whose lines I had never learned. I could not speak. Lily rubbed her eyes, looked around the unfamiliar room, and whispered sleepily, "Mommy, who is she?" The question broke the spell. Irina looked at Lily, and something shifted in her expression. She blinked slowly, then exhaled as if a missing piece of the past had finally returned to her. In Russian, she murmured without taking her eyes off Lily. "She looks like Katya when she was little." She pressed a hand to her chest, then looked at me, her voice now different, no longer mistaking me for her daughter, but filled with a profound, aching tenderness. "You are Claire, aren't you?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, I am." Irina closed her eyes for a moment, then smiled soft, weary, but carrying everything language could not contain. She gestured for me to sit beside her, and I did, still holding Lily against me. Her thin hand brushed my hair, warm in a way that should not have been possible from someone so frail. She asked about my life, about Lily, about everything she had missed. I could not answer much, only fragments, because each time I tried to speak, tears rose and choked the words away. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt as if I had returned to a place that had once belonged to me, even though I had never known it existed. Not the mansion itself, but the feeling of someone looking at me not as a stranger, but as a part of themselves. Blood. Family. Irina held my hand tightly, and for the first time since all of this began, I no longer wanted to run. Irina did not take her eyes off me for even a moment, her gaze searching for something deeper in the lines of my face, as though she were trying to read a truth buried beneath the surface. Her hand trembled as she lifted it and brushed softly against my cheek, as if confirming the reality of me through touch rather than words. The instant her fingers met my skin, a strange warmth traveled down my spine, and I felt tears rising before I could stop them. She spoke faintly in Russian, her voice roughened by age but still carrying an unmistakable dignity. "You have Katya's eyes, but your cheekbones are Michael's." Then she smiled, a smile edged with tears. For the first time in years, I felt as though someone truly saw me, not as a faint, forgettable waitress, not as a struggling single mother stumbling through life, but as Claire, a woman someone had waited for, recognized, claimed as their own. Lily stirred in my lap, then sat up, rubbing her eyes, studying the elderly woman before her with the innocent curiosity only a child could have. Irina looked at her as though she had just discovered a treasure. She leaned forward, taking Lily's tiny hand in her own, and when that frail, wrinkled hand wrapped around my daughter's small fingers, I saw Irina's eyes fill with red. She asked me in English, her voice barely a whisper, "What is her name?" I answered quietly, "Lily." Irina repeated the name as if tasting each syllable, then bent and pressed a soft kiss to the back of Lily's hand. Lily did not pull away. She giggled, ticklish from the gentle touch. Irina whispered something in Russian I could not fully understand, but one word was unmistakable: prapravnuchka, great-granddaughter. My chest tightened. I had never imagined there would be anyone in this world who would call my daughter that with such tenderness, such simple, natural affection. Irina turned back to me, still holding Lily's hand, and now her gaze carried a deep, aching sorrow. "Your mother carried you inside her while the family was running. She never lived long enough to become a grandmother, but looking at this little one now, I know she would have loved her more than anything." I looked at her and saw the tears slipping down her cheeks, not from the frailty of a body slowly failing, but from the weight of a grief that had never found rest. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The moment was too large for language. I did not know how to respond when a woman who had been a stranger only hours before could make me feel like I was being held again by arms I did not remember losing. Irina tightened her grip on my hand. "You do not have to forgive the past. I am not asking you for that. I only want time to love you and the little one, if you allow it." Her words felt like a severed thread being tied back together after so many years. I had never realized how much I needed to hear something like that. Inside me, something began to soften a piece of ice I had carried for years, one I thought was necessary to survive. I looked at Lily playing with the delicate lace handkerchief Irina had given her, and understood, for the first time, that Lily truly had someone to call grandmother now. Not in pretend games, not a kindly neighbor, but someone of her own blood, and perhaps she had something I had desperately wanted as a child, when I believed no one in the world belonged to me. I nodded, unable to add a single word. Just a small nod, but enough for Irina to understand. She smiled gently, her eyes softening, then sank back against her pillow, still holding my hand in hers. And I knew, no matter how much darkness my life had carried, this moment was a ray of light I would never forget. From that afternoon on, every Sunday I brought Lily back to the Volkov estate. At first it was because Irina asked for it, but soon it was because Lily would not stop saying her name whenever she saw me put on my coat or pick up my keys. She clung to Irina in a way that felt almost uncanny, as though some invisible thread tied together two women separated by generations but joined by a quiet, nameless kind of loss. I thought I came only for Lily, for Irina, for a duty rooted in blood I could no longer deny. But slowly I realized I was also filling in a hollow space that had long been carved into my heart. The house began to feel familiar. I remembered which steps creaked on the wooden staircase, recognized the smell of the Polish housekeeper's honey cakes she baked every Sunday morning, and even came to anticipate the soft amber light that slid through the windows of Irina's room as the day faded, bathing everything in a warm, almost sacred glow. Irina usually sat in her armchair, Lily played on the floor with old Russian dolls, and I sat across from them, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, listening as Irina told stories from the past in her deep, Slavic-tinged voice. Some stories I did not fully understand. Some she paused halfway through when exhaustion overtook her. But I stayed anyway, because hearing her speak felt like a kind of healing all on its own. And with time, I grew accustomed to Nick's presence as well. In the beginning, whenever he entered the room, I would straighten as if bracing myself. There was something about him that kept my guard up, maybe his too sharp gaze, his prolonged silences, or perhaps the whispers I had heard about the Volkov name, but he never crossed a line. He usually stood behind Irina's chair, sometimes resting a hand lightly on her shoulder in greeting, sometimes glancing at Lily with a faint smile before slipping out again like a shadow. The first time I saw him stay was on a rainy afternoon. Irina had fallen asleep from fatigue, and I did not have the heart to wake her, so I sat quietly reading while Lily scribbled on a small desk. Nick entered, paused at the doorway, then crossed the room and sat down across from me without a word. We stayed silent for 15 minutes, but that silence was different. Not tense, not awkward, just two people sharing the same stillness, both watching a little girl laugh at the shape she was painting into existence. The next time he came, he brought Lily a set of new watercolors. She was so delighted she ran in circles around the room, clutching the box like treasure. I opened my mouth to thank him, but he only shook his head. No need. Everything should begin with joy. For anyone, from that day on, his presence became a familiar part of every Sunday. He did not speak much, just small, gentle questions. Whether I had been tired that week, how things were at the cafe, whether Lily was eating well. The way he asked was neither intrusive nor detached. It felt like the way someone places a hand lightly on your back when you pass through a doorway, not pushing, just letting you know you are not alone. Once, I caught him standing in the back garden, hands in his coat pockets, watching the layers of sunset fall behind the trees. I did not dare ask what he was thinking, but the image etched itself into me. There was something about Nick that pulled me in two directions. A man who could command like a general, yet waited patiently for a child to finish coloring a flower before he left the room. Maybe I did not understand him yet, but I was no longer afraid. And perhaps the most surprising thing was that I started looking forward to each weekend, not only for Irina, not only for Lily, but for myself, for something quiet and new that had begun to stir inside me, like a seed that had fallen into soil long barren, suddenly finding rain. Nick began spending more time at the estate on Sundays, no longer slipping away after a few quiet minutes beside Irina, but often staying for hours, sitting with Lily, helping her cut colored paper, showing her how to fold tiny Japanese cranes he said he had once learned from an old friend. One afternoon I walked into the room and found the two of them sitting cross-legged on the floor. Nick bent over with careful concentration as he creased each edge of the paper, while Lily beamed and clapped her hands every time a crane appeared. The sight made me stop in the doorway for several seconds, as if I were witnessing something so fragile that stepping into the room might shatter it. Nick's gentleness was never showy, never overly familiar, but enough for me to understand he was not there only out of duty or because Irina had asked. He genuinely paid attention to Lily, watching every gesture, listening to each little babbled story, remembering which crayons she liked, which strawberry pastries she could not eat, and always staying with her whenever I stepped out to speak with Irina. One time, Lily came down with a mild fever while we were at the estate. Panic surged in me and I rushed to take her home, but Nick stopped me. Let me handle it. He motioned to the housekeeper to bring warm cloths, called the family doctor at once, and then sat beside Lily for half an hour, placing the cloth gently on her forehead, stroking her hair with such instinctive care it was as if he had been doing it all his life. I watched from the doorway, an unfamiliar feeling rising in me, not distrust, not quite trust, but something caught between two heartbeats, unsure which rhythm was real. I began to see Nick smile more often. Though his smiles were faint and fleeting, soft as morning mist, appearing whenever Lily said something silly or when Irina grimaced at the bitter medicine her elderly doctor insisted she take. He was no longer the cold, distant shadow I had met in the cafe, yet he was not entirely the gentle man he appeared to be around my child either. Something in him still held me at a careful distance. I had seen his expression harden in an instant when he answered an unexpected call, his eyes darkening as he left the dinner table mid-conversation, even as Lily tried to finish a story. I had walked past the downstairs library late one night and heard him speaking Russian in a low, cutting tone, something in it sending a shiver down my spine. Once, I saw a young man, an unfamiliar face, led into Nick's study, only to emerge 15 minutes later pale, sweating, and unable to look anyone in the eye. I did not know what had happened in that room, but nothing about it felt ordinary. I never asked, and Nick never explained. Between us existed a kind of unspoken silence. He never pushed at the parts of my life I was not ready to share, and I did not reach toward the darkness he deliberately kept hidden, but I knew it was there. I knew Nick was someone who could soothe a sick child with steady hands and, in the same day, give an order that could erase a man without leaving a shadow behind. That contradiction made him both compelling and dangerous. Once, in a quiet breath, I asked Irina as she sat knitting near the window, "What kind of man is Nick?" She looked at me, and her eyes shone with a depth far older than her years. "He is my last warrior, both sword and shield. He is not allowed to be weak. But inside him there are things even he is afraid to look at." I asked nothing more. I understood, even from the very edge of Nick's life, that I had already touched waters far deeper than I could measure, and with each passing Sunday, I realized I was no longer standing on the outside at all. I was being pulled further into that world, a world warm and fractured all at once. A world where Nick stood at the center, a man whose heart held two opposing currents, and I could no longer tell which direction I was drifting toward. I began to feel as though I was wading into waters far too deep, no longer able to see where the bottom was. With each passing weekend, I was drawn closer to the circle with Nick at its center. His gentleness with Lily, his patience with Irina, the quiet meaning in his eyes whenever he looked at me across the dinner table. It all felt like a dream, soft, shimmering, beautiful, and dangerously fragile. And because it felt too perfect, too effortless, suspicion began to bloom inside me. No one gives anything without expecting something in return, especially not in a world where men like Nick exist and command with nothing more than a slight nod. One late evening, after Lily had fallen asleep and Irina had been taken back to her room by the nurse, I found Nick alone in the library. He sat at a wooden table, a glass of wine catching the warm glow of the lamp, turning the pages of an old book with a serene expression, as though he carried nothing heavier than the paper in his hands. I stood at the doorway, my hand curling into a tight fist, trying to steady my voice. "Why are you doing all of this?" Nick did not look up. He closed the book slowly, then lifted his gaze to me. "What do you mean?" I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "I mean me, Lily. The way you are here every week, the way you treat my daughter as if she were your own, the way you look at me. I want to know what you expect." Silence spread across the room like a held breath. Nick set the wine down, rose from his chair, and walked toward me. His height cast a long shadow over the wooden floor, and I instinctively stepped back. He stopped in front of me, his eyes fixed on mine. "In the beginning, everything had purpose. You are Katya's granddaughter, the last blood of the Volkov line, and I needed to bring you back, not only for Irina, but because you were a piece in the game I was playing." I swallowed hard, my fingers clutching the edge of my dress. "I knew that. I suspected it." He nodded. "I will not deny it. I once thought that if I could keep you here, bind you with gratitude, with a sense of debt, with the child, you would never leave. You and Lily would be the softest part of my defenses, but also the strongest shield for the empire I protect." I stood frozen, my chest tightening as though an unseen hand had closed around my ribs. The very thing I feared most had just been laid bare without decoration, without deceit. But what he said next pinned me in place. But then I saw Lily laugh, saw you hold her as she slept beside you in the living room after an afternoon of play, saw the way you cared for Irina as though she truly belonged to you, and I knew I was no longer in control. I stopped thinking about leverage. I started thinking about keeping both of you safe, not for advantage, because I wanted to. His voice dropped lower, nearly breaking at the edges. His eyes no longer cold, but carrying something that looked almost like regret. "Claire, if you want to leave, I will not stop you. If you see me as dangerous, I will not blame you. But I cannot pretend anymore that you are only part of a plan. You are no longer a move on a board. You are a choice I never intended to make, but one I cannot let go of now." I turned away, my breath heavy, thick. I had always known Nick was not simple. I had once thought he was my enemy, then believed he might be a protector, then doubted everything in between. But never, not once, had I imagined he would be this honest. No excuses, no promises, just a raw truth between two people who had come from entirely different worlds. And the strangest thing was, I was not afraid anymore. I was only tired. Tired because no one in my life had ever spoken to me with such blunt sincerity. No ornaments, no sweetness, no pretense. Just a man with storm-gray eyes telling the truth. And perhaps, after everything, that was the first thing that made me start to believe him. Nick sat down in the chair across from me, his arm resting loosely on the back, his eyes no longer avoiding mine but holding steady, as if he had finally decided to uncover everything he had kept buried in the dark. I stayed silent, waiting, though there was still a quiet storm raging beneath my ribs. He inhaled deeply, his voice low and deliberate. "My father is Viktor Antonov, a name you may never have heard, but a name your family knew very well. He was once the right hand of your grandfather, trusted completely until he betrayed the Volkovs and sold their information to the American government. When Irina took me in, she stripped me of my father's name. She gave me her surname Volkov not as an honor, but as a reminder that my life now belonged to the family my father tried to destroy. I do not know the details, only that what he did forced your parents to flee Russia, cut ties with everyone, and live under false identities for 10 years in America. And then they died. Not in an accident like your records say, but in a staged death meant to erase the loose ends." I went still, my fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. He continued, his voice steady, each word slicing open another seam in the version of my childhood I had carried all my life. "When Viktor was discovered and punished by the Volkovs, he did not die. He escaped, and he raised me with nothing but hatred in his lungs. I was taught that your family ruined his life, took everything from him. I grew up in the shadow of that vengeance, trained to become a weapon. And my first mission was to find the last blood of Katya. You." Breath collapsed in my throat. My mouth felt full of sand. I had feared Nick's motives, but never, not even in my darkest imagination, had I pictured him carrying a history soaked in this much blood. He looked down at his half-empty glass of wine rather than at me, turning it slowly between his fingers. "When I first saw you in that cafe, I thought it would be simple. A lonely waitress with no one behind her, no one to protect her. I only had to approach you, bring you back to Irina, and then let everything unfold according to plan. You would feel indebted, obligated, trapped in a past you did not choose, and through you I would have control over the Volkov name. It was a perfect strategy, but then Lily appeared. Then Irina saw Katya in you and whispered her daughter's name with trembling lips. Then you sat beside Irina, feeding her soup spoon by spoon, giving her medicine with quiet patience, asking for nothing in return. You were nothing like anyone I had ever known. I thought you were fragile, but you were strong in a way I could not understand. You did not plead, did not run, but you did not pretend to be made of steel either. You simply remained. And I began to fear my own plan. Fear that if I kept going, I would destroy the one thing that made me feel human. I had never seen Nick like this. He was confessing not only his sins but the most vulnerable parts of himself. No mask, no armor, only a man raised in hatred, undone by the very thing he was taught to despise. He lifted his eyes then, and for the first time his storm-gray gaze looked almost pleading. "Claire, if you want to leave, I will take you and the child away tonight. I will erase every trace, give you a new life no one could touch. But if you stay, I want you to know there are no more schemes, only me, wanting to keep you both here, not as part of a plan but as family." My heart felt as heavy as stone, not with fear but with the weight of 100 tangled emotions. Something inside me was still rigid, unwilling to forgive being treated like a pawn. But something else softened when I thought of the way he looked at Lily, as though she was the one thing in this world he would protect at any cost. I did not answer. I only looked at him for a long, long time, knowing that whatever choice I eventually made, I would never again be the woman who walked out of that cafe on that fateful afternoon. Because I had seen the truth, and the truth might hurt, but at least it was real. Irina began to weaken visibly only a few weeks after the conversation between Nick and me. Each time I came to the estate, I found her lying down more often, her voice softer, her breath slow and thin as a thread. The storytelling faded into gentle handholds, faint smiles, and distant gazes as though she were counting time backward through her memories. Her private nurse said Irina's body was simply too tired, her heart too weak. Nothing unusual for her age, only that she no longer had anything left to hold on to. I said nothing, just stayed longer. Instead of visiting only on Sundays, I began stopping by after each cafe shift, sometimes bringing porridge I made myself, sometimes just sitting beside her bed, reading aloud in a voice soft enough to lull her to sleep. Lily slowly began to understand that the silence in the room was not sadness, but reverence. She learned to speak quietly, to sit drawing beside the bed, sometimes whispering to Irina about her days in preschool. Irina would rest her hand on Lily's hair, stroking her gently as though that small gesture was the last living memory she wanted to carry with her. Sometimes I saw her close her eyes and let tears fall, not from pain, but as though she were thanking the universe for something deep and long overdue. One rainy afternoon, as I was tucking a blanket around her, Irina took my hand and held it tight. She opened her eyes, and despite the cloudiness of age, they shone with startling clarity. "Claire, do you know something?" she said, her voice raspy yet steady. "I once believed I would die with no one beside me, no true blood left in this world. But now I see your mother in your eyes, your father in the way you refuse to give up, and myself in Lily. I have nothing left to regret." I could not hold back my tears. I bent down and kissed her fragile hand, whispering thank you, not because she had accepted me, but because she had given me the feeling, for the first time in my life, that I was part of something sacred. With each passing day, the bond among the three of us, 3 women from 3 generations, became clearer. No need for long explanations, no need for eloquent words, only presence, touch, and giving. Once, while Lily was drawing a picture of 3 people holding hands, she looked up and asked me, "Mommy, is this a family?" I did not know how to answer at first, so I simply stroked her hair and nodded. Yes, it is a family, maybe not perfect in the way most people imagine, but real. Nick appeared less often during this time, as though intentionally giving Irina and me the space we needed. Yet whenever he did appear, he would stand in the doorway for a long while, not entering, not speaking, just looking at her before quietly walking away. I understood. No matter how strong he was, Nick was not ready to watch the one person who had loved him without condition prepare to leave this world. And I, for the first time in my life, felt I was doing something right, not out of duty, but out of love. Those quiet afternoons, sitting together in stillness, Lily's laughter drifting in from the garden, the faint scent of black tea, the soft wind rustling the old curtains, all of it became pieces of a life I never imagined I would have. And when I looked up at Irina drifting to sleep with a thin smile on her lips, I knew that even if time was short, we had not missed one another. We had become something complete, close enough, and true enough to call a family. Irina passed away on a misty early morning, while the entire house was still asleep. The nurse said she left gently, as if she had simply exhaled one last time and slipped into peace. I came to her bedside while they were still closing the door, her hand loosely holding the wool scarf I had started knitting the week before. Her eyes closed, her lips curved into a faint smile as though she were dreaming of some faraway place. I did not cry then. I just sat beside her, held her hand, pressed my forehead to the back of her cold fingers, and whispered my thanks for giving me the chance to call someone a grandmother. The funeral was simple and quiet, just like the way Irina had lived her final years. Only a few trusted people came, the loyal house staff, her private doctor, and us, a small circle, but tightly bound. Nick stood motionless throughout the ceremony, speaking not a single word. He wore a black suit, held white flowers in his hand, his gaze never leaving the casket. I could see him restraining himself, refusing to allow even a flicker of weakness, as if that were the only way he knew how to honor her. After the ceremony, I carried Lily for a walk through the garden behind the estate. She still did not fully understand what death meant, and asked why everyone looked sad today. I only smiled and told her that Irina had gone back to be with her husband, back to the fields of snowflowers she used to talk about. Nick came to me later that afternoon, just as the last light disappeared behind the pines. He did not speak at first, but handed me a letter written in Irina's unsteady but unmistakable handwriting. In it, she wrote that I was the last piece of her blood she once believed was lost forever. She asked Nick to protect me the way she had protected my mother, and she wrote that if I chose to stay, then this was my home, not as a debt written in blood, but as a new beginning. I folded the letter, tears falling before I could stop them. Nick then took a small box from his pocket, nothing ornate, just dark wood carved with a single snowflower on the lid. He opened it. Inside was a simple silver ring with a pale blue stone, the same color as my eyes. "Claire," he said. "I once came here filled with hatred. I stayed out of duty. But now, standing here in front of you, I have no burdens left, only one desire: to call you my wife, to call Lily my daughter, to begin again with you, even if the world still holds its shadows." I stood there, frozen, every emotion rising like a great wave. I had once believed I would never trust promises again, that my life would be only about surviving, never about loving once more. But here was a man who had walked through vengeance, power, and darkness, only to speak one truth with absolute sincerity. I nodded, without speaking, and pulled him into a tight embrace. It was the first embrace between two people who had once lived on opposite ends of the world, and now found each other at the crossroads of loss and love. That night, Nick sat by the bed telling Lily a story about a brave grandmother, a kind mother, and a family that found its way back together after too many years apart. She yawned halfway through the tale, then rested her head on his shoulder and fell asleep. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching the two of them, and knew that at last, we had a home. No bright lights, no lavish wedding, just a single honest promise, a hand held tight, and 3 hearts ready to begin again together. I agreed to marry Nick on a June morning, when the breeze was still gentle and the sun not yet harsh, a morning so peaceful it made me forget the shadowed days I had once lived through. There was no second proposal, no lavish planning, no dazzling wedding gown or row of bridesmaids drifting down an aisle like in the movies. It was only me, Nick, and Lily, along with a few of the closest people in our lives, standing in the small garden behind the estate where Irina once sat knitting. I wore a simple white dress with mid-length sleeves, the waist tied softly with a pale blue ribbon matching the stone on the ring Nick had given me. My hair was pinned with a few sprigs of white baby's breath, my face touched with the lightest makeup, as if anything more would disturb the quiet beauty of the morning. Lily glowed in a soft pink tulle dress, holding a tiny basket of petals she had practiced scattering for 3 days straight, so earnest that both Nick and I could not help but laugh. She walked ahead of me, her steps a little unsure but her eyes filled with pride, as though she already knew how important her role was. Nick waited for me beneath an arch covered in vines and white lanterns. He wore a charcoal vest, no tie, no polished leather shoes, just himself, looking at me with a calm I had never seen in him before. When I placed my hand in his, I felt not only the warmth of skin against skin, but an unspoken promise. A promise that he would not abandon me, that Lily would have a family, that we would no longer fear tomorrow. The ceremony lasted less than an hour, yet every minute carved itself into my memory with vivid, lasting clarity. No one cried, though the elderly chef from the estate had red-rimmed eyes as he set down the small wedding cake. There was no live orchestra, but the classical music drifting from an old speaker under the porch felt ceremonial enough. We did not waltz or dance beneath the open sky. We simply ate cake, talked softly, and sometimes looked at each other and smiled for no reason at all. That afternoon, we left the estate, not to hide from anyone but to begin anew. Nick had bought a small house in a quiet area on the north side of Chicago, with a backyard big enough for Lily to play in and an attic room I could turn into a reading nook. The house was not large, but it was enough for each of us to have our own space while still feeling one another's presence in every breath. When I stepped into that house, it felt as though I had walked the entire length of my life only to finally arrive at the true beginning. We were no longer 3 scattered pieces, but a complete picture, imperfect, yet real. I unpacked each box, hung the first photograph of the 3 of us taken in last season's lavender field, and fixed onto the front door a small plaque engraved with the words, "Our Home." That first night in the new house, I lay in the middle of the bed, one hand holding Lily's, my head resting on Nick's shoulder, and understood that life could begin again not because of magic, but because of choice. And I had chosen to love, to trust, to stay, not because I was forced to, but because I wanted to. Because in the end, no matter how rough the road that brought us here had been, this was the destination. A home, a family, a simple yet profound promise. From this day forward, we will not part from one another again. A year after our wedding, I gave birth to our first son and named him Theo, a tender nickname drawn from Theodore, honoring Nick's wish to remember a man who once sacrificed everything to protect his family during the most chaotic years in Russia. The day he was born was an autumn day, leaves scattered across the hospital entrance, the air cool and gentle as if reminding me that every beginning arrives at exactly the right time if we are patient enough. Holding Theo for the first time, I felt I was no longer the lost woman standing in the middle of an old cafe, no longer the girl swept into the secrets and shadows of the Volkov family. I was now the mother of 2 children, the wife of a man who carried both light and darkness within him, the keeper of rhythm in a small home filled with morning laughter. Lily welcomed her baby brother with all the excitement of a 4-year-old big sister. She helped me fold tiny diapers, sang him lullabies she invented herself, and sometimes sat beside the crib just to watch him purse his lips in sleep. Nick held Theo with one arm, steady and gentle, as though he had been preparing for that moment his entire life. I once imagined Nick would be a strict father, but he soothed our son with the softest whispers and paced the house with him in his arms whenever Theo cried in the middle of the night. Still, I knew our lives would not always be so peaceful. As the wife of a man like Nick, I quickly learned that every good thing must be protected. So he taught me how to defend myself, not merely to stay safe, but to stand confidently in the midst of the undercurrents we could never fully escape. I learned to hold a gun, to read the subtle expressions of someone who was lying, to distinguish between the sound of ordinary footsteps and the sound of someone moving with intent. Our training sessions in the backyard began at sunrise, while Lily still slept and Theo was with the nurse. At first I was afraid, but then I understood that it was not about stepping deeper into darkness. It was about lighting a flame within myself so no one could ever extinguish it again. Nick never forced anything on me. He simply gave me a choice. And I chose strength because I did not want to return to being the woman who waited for others to decide her fate. Sometimes I stood before the mirror, noticing a small bruise on my arm from a training drill, and found myself smiling. I was no longer the old Claire. I was a steadier, stronger version of myself, calm enough to face whatever might come. We lived between the bright warmth of our small family and the shadows that still followed the Volkov name. Nick never hid what he had to do, the secret trips, the old enemies who still lingered. But he always came home, always kept the promise that my children and I would never face fear alone. On certain nights, when Theo slept soundly in my arms and Nick read by the soft glow of a lamp, I watched him and wondered how many people in this world lived balanced between two worlds the way we did. Perhaps not many, but we had chosen this path. And even with the darkness surrounding us, I knew I was not alone. I had Nick, I had Lily, I had Theo, I had a family, and I had myself no longer faint, no longer lost, but a woman who finally knew exactly what she was living for. I sat in the rocking chair by the living room window, Theo asleep in my arms with the steady breath and peaceful little face of an angel, while Lily sat on the floor coloring a picture of our family, occasionally looking up to ask me an innocent question that made me laugh out loud. The sky outside was a soft, pale blue, the November breeze drifting lightly through the trees, and I could hear the rustling of dry leaves like old memories stirring awake inside my mind. It had been nearly 2 years since that fateful day in the small cafe on the worn-down part of town. I still remembered the bitter smell of burnt espresso mixed with the damp scent of abandoned dreams, the flickering fluorescent lights casting weary shadows across familiar faces, the worn-out shoes I dared not throw away because I could not afford to buy new ones, and the way I moved through that place like a ghost no one could see. I remembered the exact moment the door opened, the bell chimed, and 4 men stepped inside so out of place that the whole room seemed to hold its breath. I remembered the first glance I exchanged with Nick, those storm-gray eyes as cold as early mist on the Volga River, and the soft Russian words he spoke into his phone that pulled something instinctive from deep within me, so instinctive that I answered in the same language I had forgotten I still carried. One sentence, one moment that felt accidental, swept me into a vortex of secrets, truths, tears, love, and destiny. There were times I wondered what my life would have been if I had stayed silent that day, if I had simply smiled, walked away, and continued pouring coffee into chipped cups. Perhaps I would still be living in a weekly rental apartment, still counting every dollar for electricity and childcare, still drifting through life invisible to everyone. And perhaps I would never have known the name Volkov, never have met Irina, never have learned I had blood and family that still existed somewhere in this world. But I did speak. I let instinct guide me without thought, without calculation, and that unguarded honesty opened an entirely new chapter of my life. I will not pretend the road was easy. I walked through fear, hurt, confusion, and deep doubts about who Nick really was. But I also came back to life. I learned to love again. I became a mother again. I touched the things I once believed I did not deserve. Someone once told me that life is made of unexpected left turns, and courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward even when your hands are shaking. My hands shook many times, but I never turned away. When I look into Lily's eyes, when she runs to throw her arms around my neck and whispers that I am the person she loves most in the world, I know everything was worth it. When Theo smiles in his sleep, his tiny hand curling around my finger as if afraid to lose me. I know I made the right choice. And when Nick kisses my forehead each morning with a tenderness that still surprises him as much as it surprises me, I know the only thing I needed to do that day in the cafe was not stay silent. I spoke. I acknowledged the language that lived in my blood. And from that moment, everything began. No one ever knows what will follow when they finally open their mouth, but I am living proof that sometimes a single sentence can change the course of an entire life. And for that reason, no matter what the coming months may bring, I will never regret that moment. The day I slipped into Russian in that shabby little cafe was the day I found myself again. Nick left Chicago on a winter morning when the snow was still falling lightly and the sun had yet to rise. He pressed a kiss to my forehead and whispered, "I will be back soon," before stepping into the car with Alexei. I did not ask for details about the trip, did not need to know exactly where he would be, whom he would meet, or what he would do. I understood there were parts of Nick's world I could never reach, and parts he did not want me to enter. But what was different from before was that I was no longer afraid. I no longer stayed awake all night with thoughts twisting into each other like a maze with no exit. I had learned to live with the quiet spaces, the secrets, and the temporary absence of the man I loved, because I was no longer the trembling Claire behind the counter of that shabby cafe. I was a woman who knew what she was protecting and why she had to be strong. In the first days after Nick left, I spent time rearranging every drawer in the house, changing the bed linens, repainting the wall where Lily had once drawn with a marker, planting new lavender pots in the backyard, and turning a corner of the living room into a space where I could read while watching the children. It was not to kill time but to keep everything moving, to avoid leaving empty spaces where longing could creep in too deeply. When Lily asked where her father had gone, I smiled and told her he was doing important work to keep everyone safe. She nodded as if she understood, then ran off to play with Theo. As for me, each night after the children slept, I sat by the window, holding the worn notebook Irina once used for her recipes, and wrote down my thoughts for the day, like a way of tracing my own growth step by step. Some nights I wrote about missing Nick, about the way he looked at Theo when he held him one last time before leaving. Some nights I wrote about the first time I managed to fix the kitchen faucet by myself, and on some nights, I wrote just one line: "I am all right." I was not pretending. I truly was all right. I realized that over the past year, the fragile layers inside me had slowly peeled away, making room for a strength I never knew I possessed. I might not handle a gun like Nick or issue orders with a single glance, but I knew how to protect my family in my own way. I knew how to keep warmth alive in our home, how to read my children's emotions, how to be grateful for every morning I woke to a life where I was loved, where I could choose, where I could stand steady. When the phone rang over the weekend, I heard Nick's voice from half a world away, low and firm as always, but with something softer woven into it. He asked about Theo, about Lily, and about me. I told him everything was fine, and for the first time, I did not have to force those words, because I truly believed I was strong enough to hold everything together, even when part of my world was thousands of miles away. Nick said he would be home soon. I believed him, but even if he came back later than planned, I would still be here steady as lavender in the wind. I would not break, would not panic, because I knew exactly who I was. I was Claire Volkov. I was a mother, a wife, the keeper of the rhythm in this home no matter what storms raged outside. And I knew that when he returned, he would find me here still myself, only stronger, steadier, and ready to walk with him through the next long stretch of the road ahead. Nick came home on an early spring afternoon, just as the first tiny flowers began to bloom along the white fence of our house. He did not call ahead. He simply walked through the familiar gate with shoulders still carrying the weight of unspoken things. I was watering the plants, my hands still dirty with soil, when I saw his silhouette through the soft sunlight. There was no music, no cheering, only the tight clasp of our hands and a long embrace, as if we both needed to make sure the other still existed. Lily ran out first and wrapped her arms around him, and Theo followed with his unsteady toddler steps and a not-quite-formed "Daddy." Nick lifted them both, then turned to me with a look that said everything without a single word. We had made it through. That night, after the children fell asleep, Nick and I sat on the porch. The moon was faint, the breeze gentle, the air quiet in a tender way. He told me about his time in Russia, the meetings, the difficult choices, and the moments when he thought of the three of us at home just to keep himself from slipping over the thin line between right and wrong. I did not ask for more. I only held his hand and told him he was home, and that was enough. It was then I understood something I had never quite found the words for all those years. Family is not a place that is always perfect or warm or peaceful. Family for me is the place where I can be myself, sometimes weak, sometimes stubborn, sometimes afraid and still be loved, still be accepted, still be seen. It is the place that grew from a shabby cafe and a single unthinking sentence. The place where I found my roots, the person who would stand by me, and the reason I rise each morning. Love does not always come from safety. Sometimes it grows from danger, chaos, contradictions, and tangled pieces. But if you are brave enough, you will find what truly matters. If I had not walked to Nick's table that day, if I had not answered him in the Russian buried deep within me, I would never have known that inside an underground empire could live a heart capable of love, arms strong enough to shelter me and my children. And most of all, I would never have known that I could belong to a family that once seemed meant for anyone except me. Now, when I watch our 2 children playing in the yard, when I see Nick fixing the gate for the 10th time after the wind has battered it, I know I am living, no longer existing, no longer struggling, but truly living with full, honest emotions, responsibilities, and faith. Our house is not large or luxurious, but it holds laughter, the smell of fresh cookies, crayon marks on the wall from Lily, and the chair where Nick reads to Theo each night. And to me, that is home. That is happiness. Thank you for listening until the very end. Did Claire's story move you? Have you ever been in a moment when a single small choice changed your entire life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear what your heart feels. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more touching, inspiring stories like it, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share the video to spread positivity every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video with stories that warm the heart and touch the soul. We wish everyone watching this a life of good health, joy, peace, and abundant love each day. Farewell, and see you soon.